I want you to take a journey with me through Scripture, and I think you'll kind of see where this is headed as we're going through it. After God had created Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel came along, and then things just sort of went downhill from there. And it got to the point to where God said he was sorry that he made humanity and he was going to destroy everything. And so it seemed hopeless. It seemed like that was it. God's experiment with humanity was over and done. But wait, there was Noah, who found grace and favor in God's eyes, and humanity was saved. Abraham was told that one of his descendants was going to bring blessings to the nations of the earth and the families of the earth. But Abraham and Sarah were childless. No biological child was coming along. And Abraham said, well, I've got somebody in my household I can adopt. And God said, oh no, you're going to have a biological son. And so then Sarah said, well, you and I aren't having it, so here's my handmaiden. And then when Ishmael is born, God said, oh, no. You and Sarah are going to have a biological son. And, before Sarah laughed, Abraham laughed. Because, he's 99 and she's 89. And even though I don't really know what life was like and when people gave up back then and when things quit working, they said, well, that's it. But Isaac was born the next year. Joseph was hated by his brothers, and they found an opportunity to get rid of him. First they wanted to kill him, but then they decided, hey, let's make some money out of this. And so they sold him slavery, and they said, he's gone. Don't have to worry about him anymore. Dad's favorite is out of our hair. We won't have to listen to his dreams, and that's it. But wait. Then, after Jacob and family moves to Egypt and they settle in later on, there's a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph, and Israel's in bondage. And when Moses goes, Pharaoh said, sorry, I'm not going to let them go. And so Israel seems destined to not fulfill the promises that God had made through Abraham, their father. But wait, 10 plagues say otherwise. Then Israel's at the Red Sea. They've escaped. And then all of a sudden, Egypt changes their mind and comes after them. But wait. Later on, after Israel had settled in the land, Naomi and her husband and 2 sons moved to Moab because there's a famine going on and they need work, and so they moved there. The 2 sons get married, but then the father dies, and then the 2 sons die. And so Naomi thinks her genealogy is ended and that she's going home bitter. But when they get back home, just wait. There's a man named Haman who despises Mordecai. And he realizes that it's the Jewish people who won't give him the honor that he deserves. And maybe he knows that they're ancient enemies to begin with. And so all of a sudden, so he's here pretty much second in command. And so he says, well, I've got a plan and a plot to destroy these pesky Jews. And so I told the king all about them. And yes, he agrees. And now he's let me pass a law. There's no hope. They're going to be gone, and I'm rid of them. But wait. There's a widow and son in the days of Elijah, and they've only got a little flour and a little oil. They're going to make some bread and then just wait the famine out and die. But Elijah comes along and says, make a little for me. And they said, well, okay. And suddenly there's hope. The flour and the oil don't give out. Later on, the widow's son dies. But wait. Elijah's successor, Elisha, promises a woman and her husband a son because they've been taking care of them. And she says, don't tease me. And they have a son. And later on, when he's older, he dies. And she runs to Elijah and says, you tricked me. Elisha comes back and guess what? Judah's in exile in Babylon. God has abandoned us. It's hopeless. We'll never get out of here. Just wait. A man comes to Jesus. His daughter is dying. She's 12 years old. He's ruler of the synagogue. And perhaps at that time there were people who said, don't go to Jesus, don't trust in him and so forth. But his daughter is dying. And so as they're going, somebody comes and says, don't bother the master, your daughter is dead. And Jesus says, just wait. One day Jesus sees a widow leading a funeral procession. Her only son is dead. He goes and touches the boy, and guess what? Abraham, who originally was told that he was going to have this son, and the son comes, it's the son of promise. I'm sure that when he was born, they pampered him to death. Well, pampered him and spoiled him. I'm sure that every day they looked at him and looked at each other and laughed. And then when he's old enough to talk, he's old enough to be weaned, God says, take him to yonder mountain and sacrifice him. And while he's going, Isaac says, here's the wood, here's the knife, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says, just wait. And in fact, the Hebrew writer says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendant shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise even from the dead, from which he would also receive him back as the type. Now, even though Isaac didn't really die, somehow Abraham knew that if he killed him, God would give him back. You see, from the beginning, our world from the beginning of sin was plunged into death and despair. It was plunged into sin and evil. At one point, early on, it got so bad God despaired of making us. He was sorry that he had to look down upon his world. He created a paradise, and now we had ruined it. And we have a tendency as humans to kind of look back and say, well, look what they did. No, if it hadn't been Adam, it had been Bob. The recounting of God's mighty deeds shows that he was not defeated in spite of his anger, in spite of his being sorry that he made us, and that he is not going to accept the situation. He worked and worked until the solution arrived. Our text, if I can get there, Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. Very early on, the first day of the week, they came to the tomb where when the sun had risen. They were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? Looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled away, although it was extremely large. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe. And they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This young man said, "Do not be amazed." Some translations say, "Do not be alarmed." And I'm sure that they were very alarmed to see this young man there. You see, the messengers that God sends, the ones we call angels, oftentimes tell people, don't be afraid. That's because they're not these pretty white boys, boyish looking guys, that sort of glow. They are, they are terrifying. Well, at least their appearance at times brings fear to people. Do not be amazed. Now you see, here they were coming, the ladies were coming there to anoint Jesus. He was dead, he's gone. Our hopes are dashed. We thought he was the one for 3 years. We watched him for 3 years. We saw signs for 3 years. We saw him put the Pharisees and the Sadducees down with his teaching. We even saw him cast out demons. We thought he was invincible. And then he dies. And they experienced what everybody, the whole world over, experiences: despair. That's what our world is like. Now, even though we might look back here in America at good times, I see these memes or so forth on Facebook about what a great time it was back in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, it was a good time. I remember back then. And I'm sure that there are lots of nations that have a time period in which things were pretty good. But we're kind of like, well, in a way, we're sort of like the cycle in the book of Judges. After a while, things are going to get bad. And that's, that's just the way it is. But it's always been bad. And if it, not for this group, but for another group. There's always somebody who's being oppressed, always somebody who needs help, always somebody in despair. That's what our world is like. And it's all because of sin. It's all because Adam and Eve directed their allegiance away from God. But again, if it hadn't been them, it would have been me. Paul, as he's giving his defense, his last defense in the book of Acts, chapter 26, before King Agrippa II, who is, pretty sure he's the great-grandson of Herod the Great, although Herod the Great is what history calls him, not necessarily what we would call him. But in there, Paul says, why do you think it's an incredible thing that God would raise the dead? Now, the word incredible is kind of interesting because it's the word for faith, but the letter A or alpha before it, which means without faith or without trust. So they don't trust that God raises the dead. They think it's not a reliable thing that God can raise the dead. But Jesus is raised from the dead. And of course, it's incredible. I mean, it's, well, not using the Jewish word, but the Greek word for that. But in our world, the interesting thing, though, is that Jesus' resurrection is credible. It is something that the loyal God will bring to us, or did bring to us. And let me share with you what Jesus' resurrection did that the world, of course, finds incredible. First of all, it conquers death. Death is a part of this world. There is no getting around it. Death and taxes are two certain things everybody says in this world. Actually, there's probably a lot more that we could add in there, but you get the idea. Death is the consequence of sin. You can eat from any tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the day you eat of it, you will die. Death is the consequence of sin, and death brings despair. I mean, how many people have experienced death in a family? Death of a spouse, death of a child, death of a parent. We know what that feels like. But it is that event we call sin that separates us from God and his purpose for humanity. You see, Adam and Eve decided that they wanted more than what God was giving them. But you see, Jesus has conquered death. Death is no more. Even if we die, if we believe in him, then there's a future resurrection for us. Death no longer has power. And the one who has the power of death has no more power himself. He's been conquered. So Jesus' resurrection conquers death. We can be assured of that one day we will see the results of that for real. Right now, it's by faith that we understand that. Second of all, Jesus' resurrection conquers this world. Originally, this was God's world. He created it his way, organized it his way. But Adam and Eve changed that. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to know what he knew. They didn't realize that they had just put Satan on the throne. They thought they were putting themselves on the throne. They thought they were getting the knowledge that they needed. They thought we are going to be masters of our own fate. But they just put Satan on the throne. They didn't realize that they had become obedient to him. You see, the way God created the world, you either obedient to him or you're obedient to somebody else. You either let him rule or you let somebody else rule. And so we all have followed in their path, and Satan rules all of us. Just as Jacob and family went down to Egypt when there was a congenial Pharaoh who knew Joseph and knew the situation, and later another one comes up who doesn't know them and puts them into bondage, so that happens to us. Satan becomes the god of this world. This world belongs to him, not to us, not to our God. But the resurrection says the world no longer is his. The resurrection takes it back. Generally, when we talk about the world, we're talking about the inhabited earth and the people in it under Satan's rule and against God. Now, all of that has changed. And of course, the resurrection of Jesus conquers sin. Sin, as I've said, is our disobedience to God. And Jesus conquers it not by saying it doesn't exist, but by forgiving it. He actually takes away the power of sin by forgiving it, or the power of death, maybe. There's no making up for our sin. There's nothing we can do that's going to make God forgive us. There's nothing we can do that, kind of brings back our relationship with God. Oftentimes we try to do that. Oftentimes we try to make up for things. If we hurt someone, we will work in order to make it better. We'll go over and do something for them. We'll give them money. We'll do extra work for them. We'll do whatever we can to try to make it up to them and hope that they'll accept us back. But it's not that way with God. Sin really is our allegiance to Satan. It's letting him dictate our lifestyle and determining our path. And once he has a hold of us, we cannot break free. But since sin is conquered, we can be restored to our original relationship and purpose with God. So the resurrection conquers sin. The resurrection also, of course, conquers the usurper, Satan. Satan took over God's world by deception. You're not going to die. God's just really hiding these things from you. But if you eat it, you'll be like him. Satan lied from the beginning, Jesus said. And he will continue to lie. And there's just no getting around it. He rules and we keep on sinning. He rules, we are obedient to him. He rules, we do what he says. We may not like it. We may not even know it. There are people being guided and directed by Satan who have no idea that they are. He's using people in the way that he thinks will keep his rulership alive. But he rules and we die. He rules and we deny the one who made us. He rules and we are helpless, powerless to stop him. He is more powerful than we can imagine. And he rules and our hearts belong to him. But the resurrection throws him out. You see, the paradise that God created tumbled into a place of evil, death, and despair. I'm sure when Cain killed Abel, that Adam and Eve were greatly distressed and wondered, how, looked at each other and said, we're responsible for this. But in the midst of that death and despair and evil that was there, God was working. Throughout Scripture, and that was the purpose going through the first of it, that first run was to show you this is what our world is like. Evil abounds, and sometimes it appears no hope is there, and then God intercedes. Through Scripture, we see the hints that he was throwing out, that one day he would change things. One day he would reclaim us and the world he created. And the resurrection is proof that he won, not Satan. When Jesus died on the cross, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, the elders, and all of those who hated Jesus, the Romans and everybody else in Jerusalem who was not on his side, and Satan said, good riddance. He's gone. We've won. But 3 days later, Jesus said, no, I've won. That's the good news. We get to tell the world that we live in a place where there, in spite of, the work that we try to do, in spite of the justice we try to seek, in spite of the good we try to do, it's all going to end in death. And sometimes it ends before then because there are evil people standing in our way. But the good news is Jesus has changed all of that in his resurrection. And that we can tell the world. And I hope that you're living the resurrection. I hope that you're living the new life. I hope that you're living the new allegiance that the resurrection creates for you and for the whole world. And I hope that when you get an opportunity, you share that good news with others. And I hope that God gives you the opportunity. And so we live in a world where evil abounds. But Jesus says, no, I abound. He's risen from the dead. He's ascended to the right hand of the Father. And he is making the world his footstool. And one day he will come back again. And we then will see the final results of what his resurrection created. God bless.